Welcome to the Illustrator Studio. I am Jesse Kowalski, curator of exhibitions at the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. The Illustrator Studio is a weekly interview series, a project of the museum's Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies. One of the modern fantasy masters, Charles Vess began his career drawing for Heavy Metal magazine and National Lampoon. He soon found work at Marvel Comics and later DC Comics. Along the way, he met author Neil Gaiman, with whom Vess has collaborated many times. At the World Fantasy Awards in 1991, Vess and Gaiman won the award for Best Short Story for their work on the Sandman comic book. Vess went on to win Best Artist at the World Fantasy Awards in 1999, 2010, and 2014. And I am thrilled to speak with him today. Welcome, Charles.
Thanks for having me.
So in looking through photographs of your studio, I see a lot of references to illustration. In a quick glance, I saw Walt Kelly's Pogo comic strips and Miyazaki figures, Astro Boy, and doll Coco the Clown from the Fleischer Brothers.
Yes.
So I was just wondering what kinds of things inspired you growing up?
Well, I don't know about, once I got to college, it was, I discovered Arthur Rackham and Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth and all those great illustrators. When I got, although in college, I was in fine arts, and they definitely looked down their noses at narrative art. And if you put a figure in there, they started laughing you out of the class. So once I got out of school, I started working in animation. So I've always been aware of the various things that happen in animation. And I fell in love with Miyazaki after the first time I saw My Neighbor Totoro and saw it in Japanese. No subtitles, but you could figure out sort of the story, and just loved it. Discovered Swedish illustrator John Bauer, and there's so many others. I love, it's sort of like this Sherlock Holmes, looking after clues and finding some artist that's mentioned some other artists, and then you go looking for them. It used to be a lot harder when there was no internet. There weren't even art books in 1970. They just didn't have them. So it was much harder then. You'd see one little picture in a magazine and go, oh, I want more. But where would you go? So it's a little easier nowadays.
Yeah, I remember in college, illustration was treated the same
Yeah.
for me. You know, they kind of skipped through it and went straight to abstract expressionism.
Oh, my school was totally into abstract expressionism.
Do you see a difference between fine art and illustration, or do you consider yourself a fine artist or an illustrator, or do you consider them the same?
It depends on what I'm doing. I'm always a romantic artist, and always a narrative artist. I love to tell stories. My favorite thing is to do a painting that will imply a story, but is not connected to any particular one. And hopefully each viewer will make up their own story. And that's a really fun thing to think about. And to me, that is fine art. But if you're illustrating Spider-Man, as I did, or some other kind of work for hire character, then it's definitely illustration, but you try to infuse it with as much of your own personal input as possible.
Yeah, you mentioned the influence of Arthur Rackham. I also see a lot of Czechoslovakian artists, Alphonse Mucha in your work.
Yes.
And Brian Froud and Ruth Sanderson are some of the contemporary artists I also see in your work. And I was wondering, what artists today do you look to?
Oh, well, I'm always looking at when I moved to New York City, I shared an apartment with Michael Kaluta, and for 12 years. And he's a fabulous artist. Sometimes a little crazy, but good crazy. And all the stories you could tell. But any particular modern artist, Jean-Baptiste Monge is really fun, makes me excited. It's just the art that makes my fingers itch and makes me want to run to the drawing board and start drawing. That's what I like. And there's quite a few of them. I like, Ruth's and Brian's work, Alan Lee. I've known them, both Alan and Brian, since 1982, maybe.
Yeah, and did you go to school for illustration, or is it something that you?
Well, I thought I was. I went into commercial art, but the school I went to, it was commercial art for them was teaching you how to do hand paste up and design ads. And the thought of 4 years of hand paste up was not something I was going to stay sane doing. So I switched into fine art, painting and printmaking. Specializing in printmaking, lithography, and that kind of thing. And it was, trying to be as subversive as possible. Again, I couldn't use narrative, but I used a lot of my love of George Harriman's Crazy Cat cartoons with strange landscapes and things happening.
Yeah, and what was your first illustration job?
Ooh. Something in the early, in the 70s, local stuff. Once I moved to New York City, which had been 1976. Actually, almost my first job there was Kaluta knew a lot of other artists, comic artists, and one of them, Walt Simonson, was hired to do illustrations for Abrams Books, which was a big art house publisher. But they were doing an edition of The Hobbit using illustrations by the Rankin and Bass animation that came out at that time. But that didn't cover all the text. So they were getting artists to draw in that style. And they had 6 or 7 of us doing it. We were not allowed to sign the pictures. But if you ever see that big book of The Hobbit that's based on the Rankin and Bass, all the paintings of the barrels, that's mine.
Yeah, so I mentioned your work at Heavy Metal magazine. So a number of great illustrators worked there in the 70s. Jean Mobius-Giraud, Howard Chaykin, Bill Stout, Mike Kaluta, Richard Corbin, Alex Nino, Jim Burns, Joe Jusko. I mean, just, a stellar cast. So what was it like working with those great artists?
Well, you didn't really work with the artist. You worked with the editor who was just picking the art. I did a number of pieces for them until finally the editor took me aside and went, "Charles, your work is just too nice for us." They wanted it a little more vicious, a little more misogynist, that kind of thing. And that was not something I was interested in doing. So
yeah.
Luckily for me, Epic Illustrated came along, and I started doing work for Archie Goodwin over at Marvel.
Yeah, I found a self-portrait you did for either National Lampoon or Heavy Metal. Yeah. Were you thinking of Rockwell's triple self-portrait when you did that, or?
No, I was just trying to make some money to eat. And it was, if it was my choice, I would never have done the science fiction, but they wanted some science fiction. So I tried to draw spaceships. I'm really bad at spaceships.
So you brought up Epic Illustrated. So in 1981, you wrote and illustrated a story titled The Children of the Stars that was published in Epic Illustrated number 8, which was an adult fantasy comic book that Marvel published. And in 1987, Dark Horse Comics reprinted that story and others in a series titled The Book of Night. So what was the response to the release of The Children of the Stars in 1981?
A muted silence. It wasn't, again, it didn't have, the women's legs weren't long enough, the breasts weren't big enough, and there weren't enough people being chopped up. I was always more for lyrical and whimsical and poetic, and that was not quite the audience that usually read Epic Illustrated or Heavy Metal. So it took a long time to find my audience, shall I say, and segueing from that into superheroes, which was a very odd thing for me. I loved reading Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and all those things growing up, but I never thought I would draw them. And being asked to do, I think the first story I did for Marvel proper was a Doctor Strange story. And then later on, I sort of got connected to Spider-Man, which was, fine because I grew up thinking, reading Spider-Man, loving it. I did gymnastics in high school, thinking about Spider-Man. Then you're living in New York City, and there's all this cool architecture way up there in the in the tops of the buildings, and you're like, oh, if you could just swing up there and look at it, it would be great. So when I was drawing Spider-Man, I let all that love come out.
Yeah, so bringing up Spider-Man, so you painted the cover of the debut issue of the Web of Spider-Man series in '85, and I think I told you before, but that was one of my favorite comic books growing up, and I still have several issues. In fact, I have this cover here.
Yes.
Signed Vess, yeah.
Yeah.
And then in 1990, you wrote and illustrated a graphic novel, Spider-Man Spirits of the Earth, in which Peter Parker travels to Scotland and encounters fairies and ghosts and an evil cult. And I was wondering, that seems more of your style with the fairies and things. And was that your idea, or was that Marvel's idea?
Definitely my idea. I woke up one morning with the idea in my head, and I wrote it down and submitted it, and they agreed to do it, which surprised me a whole lot. And I got to write off several trips to Scotland because of that. And just, I love that landscape, and I didn't want to be drawing 10 million windows in New York City for, the year and a half I worked on the book. So I would much rather draw a landscape. And it did pretty well. It sold well, and the royalties from that, excuse me, it's Marvel, the incentives from that helped us buy a house, our first house.
Oh, that's good.
Yay, Spider-Man.
Yeah, I mentioned you have a long working relationship with fantasy author Neil Gaiman. So I was wondering, when did you first meet, and how did you get started working together?
It's a little complicated. There used to be a magazine called Amazing Heroes, and they came up with the idea of doing a swimsuit issue every summer, wherein they asked all the artists that drew comics to do skimpily clad women, superheroes, mutants, whatever. And it sold really well for them. And they asked me, and I went, here, what will I come up with? So I did this. I was doing Warriors 3, the story, the Asgardian Warriors 3 at the time. But I love a British, actually a Virginian writer, James Branch Cabell. And he has this hilarious story where Jurgen, his hero, has been told by his mother to go out into the world and make a fine figure of himself. And he's dense enough to think that he's supposed to actually sculpt a figure of himself. So every time he gets caught into a pile of mud, he's always sculpting a fine figure of himself. So I used that idea with Volstagg and the Warriors 3 and said thank you to James Branch Cabell. And the editors of the magazine thought that I was talking about an older illustrator. And that's what they said underneath of it. And then in the next issue, there was a letter from Mr. Neil Gaiman of England saying, excuse me, but James Branch Cabell had explained who he was, and who was quite famous at the time. And he was one of the first writers taken before the Supreme Court for obscenity.
Oh, wow. And
the obscenity is, I mean, you read it now and you're like, it's hard to imagine that you'd think it was obscene. But so when we met at San Diego Comic-Con in one of the aisles in whenever that was, 88 or 89, and it was before Neil was Neil, so he could stand in the aisle and no one would bother him. We just started talking immediately about James Branch Cabell. And then he asked me if I wanted to draw an issue of Sandman. The rest is history, I suppose.
So in 1991, you worked on Sandman number 19, based on Shakespeare's play Midsummer Night's Dream. And that book won the World Fantasy Award for Best Short Story that year, the only comic book to ever win that award. And I understand that after that, there was a little bit of controversy, perhaps, where they decided that comic books didn't belong in that category, that they belonged in a category by itself.
Well, they just didn't want comics in there. They just changed the rules. They didn't say you can't have a comic. They said a short story is this many words. And it sort of guaranteed that comics were going to be in that. The evening that we won that award was the evening that Neil came back from another party and found me, and we walked out into the desert and talked about Stardust for the very first time, so, which was a big project.
So you were named Best Artist at the World Fantasy Awards 3 times. Other artists who've won the award include Tim Hildebrand, Jeff Jones, Michael Whalen, Don Mates, Edward Gorey, Greg Manchester, and Frank Frazetta, and others.
Yeah.
And I believe Michael Whalen and Sean Tan are the only other artists to win 3 times.
I don't know. I never counted.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I wondered, do major awards like this inspire you, or are you always just thinking
Well, they're
about the next
fun.
project?
You're fun. You look up on your mantle and see these awards, and they're really the World Fantasy Awards are particularly ugly but wonderful in a sort of bizarre manner. And you put hats on them and do all these things. It's was sculpted by Gahan Wilson in a portrait of H.P. Lovecraft in the style of an Easter Island statue. So they're quite unique. They know they don't do them anymore. They have a different. They've redesigned the statue. But all of those awards, it really they're fun to win. I can't. But it doesn't. Once you get back to your drawing board, it's still you and the drawing board and the blank sheet of paper that you have the war with.
Yeah, so you mentioned working on Stardust with Neil. So that's a modern fairy tale set in England in the early 1800s. The book won several awards, and in 2007, it was made into a feature film with Robert De Niro, Michelle Pfeiffer, Claire Danes. So I was wondering, what involvement, if any, did you have with the motion picture? And when you were working on the book, did you expect that Hollywood would want to produce this?
It was optioned several times before it became a movie. At one point, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman were going to be the stars. There was another time when just various actresses wanted to be Stardust, and none of it ever happened. The only involvement I had with the book, the movie, was accepting a very large check and cashing it. Neil made sure my name was on the screen because he felt like the book would not have happened without my art and without that collaboration. So the Hollywood was perfectly willing to completely ignore my contribution, but he insisted on it. So it happened, and I got to go to the premieres and walk the carpets and see all the actors. I even went to Pinewood and watched them film some for a weekend, and got to meet Michelle Pfeiffer when she was in her hag outfit, and she never got out of that. She was always crunched and looking up like this. But apparently she had taken a number of years off to raise some children, and she'd also been taking art classes and trying to learn how to paint. So we had this lovely conversation about art and what it was like to create things with this strange hag looking up at me. It was surreal but fun.
So what is your process for creating a painting from start to finish?
Well, an eraser, a pencil, an eraser. I think the eraser is the most important tool you'll ever have in your life. You should always be able to change your mind. And I have a sturdy piece of paper, and I start drawing on it and scribbling, and then I erase a lot and scribble. I yell at the walls. I throw things at the walls, not always, but sometimes. And then you come up with the piece that is sort of based on what was in your mind, but it's usually different. And I will outline those pencil drawings with a ink line and then wash over that with color. And in a week or so later, there will be a finished piece, if I'm lucky. So sometimes the Stardust had 175 paintings in it.
Wow.
Not all of them full blown. Some of them were small, quite small. But it still that was a year and a half, 2 years of work.
And then in 2006, you worked with George R.R. Martin on his book, A Storm of Swords, in which were included 75 of your illustrations.
Yeah.
I've heard he's a bit eccentric, but a very, very nice guy. And,
really fun. Yes.
Yeah, so I wondered, what was it like to work with him?
He was very easy. He was always willing to help, but he was always on tour. So you couldn't track him down. And sometimes you'd be doing a drawing, and you'd have to read. This was the third book in the series. They're all very large, long books. and you'd have to read all of those to get some of the character descriptions. And they were drawing, say, the Hound, the guy Klangen or whatever, and he's got a scar on his face, and you're like, what side of the face does he have the scar on? And George would be on tour, and he wouldn't be communicating because he had no official Bible, what they call a Bible book. Sure. So after a while, I went, well, if it's not on the right side, they can flip it, but, digitally flip it. But he was really fun. It's not quite the world I want to live in, but it was an interesting project. Mm-hmm. I spent about 4 years on the thing.
Wow. In 2003, you collaborated with World Fantasy Award-winning author Charles Vess, who you've worked with a few times. You worked on A Circle of Cats that year, and then at the 10th Annual Spectrum Awards, you were awarded the Gold Award for Best Book Art. So how does it feel to be so well respected among your peers?
It feels really good. It's for the little kid who grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia. It's like, you sit in your studio and you work and you work and you work, and then you go out sometimes, and then you're confronted by the fact that people have been following your work and being inspired by your work and all that. And it's not something you really ought to be thinking about when you're drawing, because you're really drawing for yourself. But it's heartwarming, it's wonderful, and it's thrilling, really. So,
do you think you're ever going to retire, or are you just going to keep going?
Well, I was just filling out my Social Security thing. I'm turning 70 in June. So, but no, I can't imagine retiring. I mean, I have lots of ideas stored up that I'd like to draw. I'd like to maybe do a few less books and paint some more for myself. So, but most of these book projects, they seem to be taking longer and longer. The Earthsea, the Book of Earthsea that I illustrated, took 4 years, and it was in deep collaboration with the writer, and it was really fun to get to know her, because she was a wonderful, wonderful writer and wonderful person, and very acerbic wit.
Yeah, so that was Ursula K. LeGuin.
Yes.
And it was the 50th anniversary, I think, of the first time they were published. Yeah. Yeah, so you worked with many of the top fantasy authors of our time. So I guess if you could travel back in time, what fantasy author from the past would you like to work with?
Oh, Dunsany. But I think that's really the one that I can think of. I love reading. It's really interesting process now to read some of these books, beautiful books that were written in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they're written for a different world. And you really have to slow your clock down to read them, because a lot of times they use a lot of adjectives. It's not quick, immediate reads. And sometimes that's good to do, instead of, renting downloading a 12-part TV series and watching it one day. It's like, savor it.
So in 2009, I saw your name literally every day. My daughter became infatuated with your book, Blueberry Girl, that you worked on with Neil Gaiman. And it remains one of my daughter's favorite books. She's 14 now, but she still loves your work. So have you found it to be the case that a certain book that you worked on resonates with people more than others?
There's some, yes, some that have been noticed more. That was just an amazing project, because I think it's an 18-line poem that has no protagonist whatsoever. And it was beautiful and very poetic. And I didn't want to take away from any of that, but it's a book, and you have to sort of try to put in a protagonist that will move the reader through it. And it was a long conceptual birthing of that book. But once it was done, I watched people read it in my pencil form, very finished pencil, and women especially would be in tears. So
Sure.
I went, okay, I'm doing it right, So, and it's really, it's nice to be associated with some books that people read over and over and over again.
I think your first novel, The Queen of Summer's Twilight, from 2019, you have it available to read for free on your website. Why did you decide to allow readers free access to the book?
Why not? I had been.
You don't see this often.
No. And not that many people will have read it, but it's there if you want to do it. I will probably self-publish that sometime this year or early next year, to get it into print. It's a book that just started cascading in my head, and it was a long story, and I couldn't stop writing. I would come into the studio and say, well, I'll just do a little bit of work, and then 2 or 3 hours later, it'd be in 1,000 words. I'd be like, oh my God, here I go. But it was a story that was, I guess I would call it a gift from whatever it was from, and is something I needed to do. It was right. I wrote it right after I'd done another book called The Greenwood, that is a combination of graphic narrative, illustration, and text. And no editor ever got it. They couldn't understand why you'd want to do that. And I just thought it was a wonderful thing. And I think, and I was supposed to publish that through a company called Tachyon, really nice publisher. So we'll see. It'll be sort of a Kickstarter because they can't afford to pay me to do all the drawing.
Sure.
But they will be the fulfillment. They will publish it and ship it and mail it, which is all good because I'm really crappy at shipping and mailing stuff. I want to draw.
Well, when you start the Kickstarter, let us know, and we'll put it on our Facebook page. So I guess the last question I wanted to know about digital art, because I'm working on the show Enchanted, which will be our big fantasy exhibition this summer at the museum. And in going through the list of artists, I assume that a lot of the modern artists would be working with digital, when in fact, it was actually very few. Most work in traditional media. So I wondered if you have worked at all with digital, and how do you see digital art affecting the future of fantasy illustration?
Have you got a couple hours? I don't use digital art. I use, as I get older, my eyesight gets a little more blurry every day. I usually have agreements with a publisher for them to scan in all the artwork and then send it to me, and I can zoom in on a face where I've dropped a bit of paint on it and needs to be gone, and I'll just digitally get rid of it. I work in a transparent medium. It's not really watercolor, it's FW colored inks. And you can't, the only way to get rid of a splop of color on a face or a body or a hand is to use something opaque, and it always looks so obviously there. It drives me crazy. But in Photoshop, boom, boom, it's done. I know a lot of artists that work in digital, but every art director I know that talks about it wants digital because they can change it really easily.
Sure.
And that's not my job. I don't want to change it. We agree on a picture and I paint that picture. And it's, I don't want to make the background red or yellow or green or orange for them. It's what I've done. It's what you get. And also, like, I remember in the early 80s working on a Spider-Man story so that I could make the money to fly to London, to go to the Tate Gallery and sit in front of the Lady of Shalott, and the plus was Malaise Ophelia was right on the other side of the door, and see the original. And when you see an original, it's like you're having a conversation with the artist, whether they're dead or alive or whatever it is. But you can really, that's why they're museums, is so you can go and see that. And anytime I'm in a show that they have a beautifully printed Chrome of a digital piece, I'm not having that conversation. I'm looking at the shiny surface. It doesn't work for me. And I'm old fashioned and I'll die and it'll be okay. So some people love it. So I let them love it.
Well, that's all the time we have for now. Thank you, Charles, for all the great work you've done. For more information, check out Charles' website at greenmanpress.com. That's greenmanpress.com. And our own websites, nrm.org, illustrationhistory.org, and visit the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies at rockwell-center.org. As always, don't forget to subscribe to be notified for the latest content. This has been a production of the Norman Rockwell Museum. To watch the video of this podcast or to see the images referenced in this episode, please visit nrm.org/podcast. New episodes from the Illustrator Studio are released every Monday. For questions or comments, please email us at podcast@nrm.org.